50 or 60-pound pit bull or a Rottweiler or, some of these other large dogs, they can do a lot of damage to you.
Basically, you're saying, yeah, I'm going to kill this animal that you don't otherwise have the legal right to do, because the greater harm from this animal would be injury to me or my family.
This is the In Self-Defense Podcast with Don West, Steve Moses, and Shawn Vincent, exploring high-profile self-defense cases and identifying the lessons learned for concealed carriers. Hey everybody, I'm Shawn Vincent. I am the host and moderator of In Self-Defense. I'm glad you've joined us today. Welcome to the podcast. Today we've got an interesting topic. It's something we haven't discussed before. It's self-defense against animals. I came across this story in the news about a guy who encountered a bear in his house or in his yard. There's some discrepancy in the stories. He ended up shooting this bear 3 times. The last time he shot the bear, he said, was to put it out of his misery. He didn't face any legal consequences for this action, at least none that we could tell from this story. But it brought up an interesting conversation about how do you handle yourself if you're threatened by an animal. It's surprisingly something that Don West, he's National Trial Counsel for CCW Safe, is asked a lot. He takes a lot of phone calls from people who have had an encounter with an animal and they've discharged their firearm. Usually they don't shoot the animal. It's usually a warning shot, a loud noise to get the animal to run away. Sometimes that works. They want to know, do they face any liability by doing that? The answer is complicated. Could be. You don't generally get in trouble for firing in self-defense against an animal, but different municipalities have different rules about the discharge of firearms within that jurisdiction. You have to be aware of that. Steve Moses, he is a well-regarded firearms instructor. He's going to talk to us about even if it's a warning shot against an animal or even firing in self-defense against an animal, you are responsible for what happens to that bullet. And that could cause you some issues. We have some more things that we're going to discuss. We'll get to it. Here is my conversation with Don West and Steve Moses about self-defense against animals. And before we get to that, I just want to remind you guys that these discussions are for your information and educational purposes. They are not specific legal advice. They are not specific tactical advice. What we do on this podcast is we look at high-profile self-defense, use of force cases, and we look for lessons learned for armed defenders and concealed carriers. We have an informed conversation and analysis of real-world events. Our goal is to help illustrate the lessons that will allow you to make smarter choices as an armed defender or a concealed carrier. And we hope you get a little something out of this podcast today. Thanks again for listening. So, Don, you and I know somebody who ended up being in a self-defense shooting against a person, but they originally got that firearm because they were concerned about a dog in their neighborhood that was often without a leash and was threatening, and that they felt they might need to defend themselves against that dog. I know that we get calls from CCW Safe members sometimes, and they've had an encounter with a dog, a wild dog, or a dog that's just loose, and maybe they've discharged their weapon. And we came across this case in the news where a man in California encounters a bear in his yard. Maybe this bear came into his house or came close to it. His door was open and he used a firearm. In this case, he shot the bear, and the bear ended up dying. I think he shot him 3 times. The Fish and Wildlife came out to investigate this. This guy wasn't charged. And I don't know. It's kind of a self-defense case. I think a bear is capable of great bodily harm or death, right? Steve, I see you shaking your head.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I have plenty of respect for bears. Those things are incredibly strong. And I remember, golly, back in the day, I believe it was Lyle Alzado, that he actually wrestled a bear and he was significantly larger than the bear. And so he goes up there and kind of locks up that bear, and that bear just slams him to the ground. And Lyle, he was quite a physical, specimen at the time. So I would definitely have serious respect for a bear, even if it were, a yearling bear. It may
Yeah.
be a 70, 80 pound bear, but I think we talked about that bear can still climb a tree using nothing more than digging its claws into the
Uh,
bark. Imagine what it can do if it digs its claws into me.
now it's a bear, so it doesn't have the same legal rights, I think, that a person does. If you shoot a bear in your yard, uh, a civil rights attorney is not going to come to your town and get national press and say that you've done something terrible in the same way that if you had shot a person, it might have been done. But
I don't know. It may not be that group that comes, but there are some pretty adamant animal rights lovers, people that are crusading and campaigning against any kind of cruelty to animals. And what you would be
mhm,
looking at, uh, not, seriously, what you'd be looking at is an assessment of whether what you did in your mind to protect yourself from this wild, aggressive animal was reasonable and necessary. And that's more the calculation. It's not self defense in that sense. It's really a necessity defense. It's the lesser of two harms. So it's
uh-huh,
a different legal standard and different legal considerations. But basically, you're saying, yeah, I'm going to kill this animal that you don't otherwise have the legal right to do because
hmm
the greater harm from this animal would be injury to me or my family.
right. Let's kind of take it back a step. Let's just talk about if you use a firearm to either ward off an animal or to shoot an animal that you fear is going to attack you or your family. Now you've discharged a firearm. So just right there, kind of what are the legal ramifications? I know I've been out in rural Lake County, Florida, where throughout the afternoon you just hear cracks of gunfire, in the background, like it's nothing, nobody cares. And then there are other neighborhoods where if firecrackers go off, then all of a sudden police are there responding to gunfire shots, and there's different ramifications. So, can you talk a little bit about if somebody discharges a firearm, no one's hurt, no animals even hurt, what goes on there?
Well, I think if you're going to look at the isolated act of discharging the firearm, there's probably an ordinance or a statute that prohibits the discharge of a firearm within city limits or county limits or whatever political subdivision you're in. So it's entirely
Mm-hmm.
possible that if you aren't out in the woods and you just shoot around into the ground, regardless of the context of it, you are subjecting yourself to some sort of prosecution. It usually isn't. Sometimes it's just as long as it wasn't so reckless that it truly endangered somebody, they don't get too excited about it. That's why
Yeah.
people aren't allowed to shoot guns off on the New Year's Eve anymore. You just it's dangerous. The bullet has to land somewhere. So that's a relatively low level criminal offense. That's probably if you discharged a firearm, even in the context of shooting at or in the vicinity of an animal, that's what you would be facing. If you hit
hmm
the animal and it was concluded that it was unnecessary and it was otherwise cruel, you could be prosecuted for animal abuse. And that can be actually quite a serious charge, a felony charge, depending on the circumstances. So there's still an assessment you have to do whether you truly are at in danger, at
Yeah.
risk. What you can't be prosecuted for, though, is gun pointing at an animal. There's no aggravated assault of a bear or a bull or a coyote.
So you're gonna bet your defensive display is gonna work
Right.
on the bear. Yeah.
You're good there.
Well, Steve, we are firmly anti warning shot on the In Self Defense podcast, and We've never come up with a good circumstance where a warning shot against a person was ever a good tactical or legal idea for the defender. But in one of our conversations in the past, you said if you had to be pressed, the one circumstance that you could imagine where you'd fire a warning shot would be at maybe a wild animal to ward them off. Do you want to talk a little bit about that now since we're on this topic?
Well, actually, when I was saying that, I was thinking of it less as wild animals, as more and more so than domestic dogs and feral dogs. I live out in a community. There's about 4,000 acres out here. I assume there's maybe 400 or 500 homes
Hmm.
at most. We're outside the city limits, and when you walk your dog, it's not uncommon to walk past a yard in which there is a dog that's barking furiously. My dogs tend to do it when other dogs come by. That is more or less my concern. And so, if I had reason to believe that a dog, but this is be the same thing true if it were a coyote or coyote's probably about the most, or a bobcat.
Mm-hmm.
Now if you have a coyote or a bobcat that comes after you out here, I'm probably going to shoot that thing because that's really unusual. That animal's probably sick, possibly rabid. Uh, I would probably shoot that animal if it was coming for me. But in reference to just a dog, still I would try to. And I've had the heck bitten out of me by little dogs too. I'm willing to
Yeah.
take a little bit of abuse from a little dog, but 50 or 60 pound pit bull or a Rottweiler or some of these other large dogs, they can do a lot of damage to you, much more so than people think. I'm actually in a situation where there's ditches all the way around. It would be relatively easy for me to be able to take my gun, aim it at the ditch, and yell at the animal and put a round in it. If I felt like that had a strong possibility of deterring that animal, and indeed I was legitimately in fear that I was going to be bit by that dog or my wife was going to be bit by that dog. In that particular instance, there's very little downside to me other than I'm sure somebody's going to be unhappy about it. But in
Yeah.
terms of anything criminal or just, even someone being able to, sue me or anything like that, I don't think that's going to happen. My big concern is always going to be is if you are indeed within city limits, especially in certain cities where if you do discharge a gun, even if it's a warning shot, there's a high possibility that you might be prosecuted.
Yeah, I can tell you, having been involved in a number of those cases where animals were shot at or shot, some killed, some injured, that uh, there's never been a criminal case that I'm aware of that came out of that, either through a warning type shot, the unlawful discharge, or an animal cruelty. They were investigated, they were taken seriously, but that never resulted in a criminal offense. we I've even known cases where a dog, you're talking about certain breeds that are notorious for being aggressive, and not just aggressive, but physically strong and capable and almost impossible for a normal sized person to defend themselves against. Where an individual was attacked by one of those dogs and actually defended himself with a knife. I mean, it was ugly, nasty, bloody, and the dog died, but there was no question there was a risk of serious injury or death to this individual, and he did.
Yeah.
It was a horrible thing. And now I'm very critical and judgmental of the owners that have animals that are aggressive and big, that don't take proper precautions to be sure they don't get out, dig under the fence, or get loose, or roam the neighborhood and put people at risk. That's just one of those things for
Yeah.
me, because some people can defend themselves. Some people have a gun or some way, pepper spray or something, but there's a lot of folks out there and kids that just
Yeah.
can't.
Kids.
Mhm.
Steve, I want to underscore something you said when we were talking about discharging the firearm, whether you're shooting at the animal or you said you'd shoot into the ground. And so if someone was going to fire a warning shot to try to ward off an animal, you're still responsible for where those bullets go.
Yeah, exactly. So it needs to be, so it's very much in a downward position as opposed to off at a diagonal. Especially if you're anywhere like to me, I would really hate to have to put a round into concrete. And in most
Yeah.
instances, though, if I'm out on a walk or something, there's probably grass or something, around. So, but
Yeah.
out here, I mean, just pretty much straight in the ground. Uh, I don't think that bullet's capable of endangering anybody if I do it in that manner.
John, when we're talking about self defense against a person, we're strong believers that you or someone in your party, if you can be the first one to contact authorities about it, that's a good idea. I can imagine that somebody who maybe warded off a dog with a warning shot, or even shot a dog maybe while they're out on a long walk. It's not clearly their neighbor's dog, for example,
Mm-hmm.
might be
Mm-hmm.
inclined to walk away from that thing and not call authorities. What considerations legally should somebody like that think about?
Yeah,
It's a tough.
that's kind
Yeah,
of a tough call, especially if you fired a shot in a safe manner, and you know it was a safe manner the way Steve describes it, and the animal wasn't injured and just runs off. Um, we're not giving legal advice, but I don't know that I would be the first one to invite law enforcement into that situation if I didn't think there was going to be someone else that did, or
mm,
I don't feel as compelled to do that as if there's a shot fired involving an interaction with a human being. I do
yeah,
feel if you shot the dog and the dog is injured, that you should let I guess the Humane Society, they don't call them the ASPCIA anymore. It's, Humane Society come out and deal with the animal and take care of it and get treatment if
yeah.
necessary and do the humane thing at that point. It's a tough call though. I think whether if you know sort of no harm no foul kind of thing, whether you would invite law enforcement.
Yeah. And so, one thing when we talk about all of these circumstances, the reason there's no guidebook to self defense because every scenario we ever encountered has its own unique facts, and the we can't give people advice on how to specifically negotiate. There's not one rote thing you can say to law enforcement that's appropriate in every self defense circumstance, right? So it's a lot of discretion about your circumstances, where you are, and what contributed to the moment.
Yeah, and I'll tell you what, I would probably go ahead, especially where I live, I'd probably go ahead and call 911 and ask them to put me in touch with animal control. In many instances, the authorities, uh, they have an animal control person in order to deal with such situations like this. So that's probably what
Mm-hmm.
I would do out here. But again, definitely, if I shot that dog, the biggest problem with shooting a dog is that what happens if you shoot the dog and it doesn't kill it?
Yeah.
And so, I
Yeah,
mean, the thing is, okay, well, I mean,
that
yeah, humanely, I want to put that dog out of its misery, but I may be exceeding my legal rights there.
that came up in this bear case that
Mm-hmm.
the bear had been shot, climbed up a tree, fell out of the
Mm-hmm.
tree, and the homeowner shot him a third time and told his neighbor, who was begging him not to do it, that he had to put him out of his misery.
I can see why he did it. I think that's something probably that we should really think about doing and question as to whether or not uh, that's the best thing for us. It may not be the best thing for the animal. I mean, the
Mm-hmm.
idea of hearing a dog yelping like that is just to me that's heart wrenching. But again,
But
I've got to think about myself. I've got to think about my family.
but the complications here about the discharge of a firearm bring us back to the same conclusion we have when we talk about self defense against a person, is that if you can avoid having to use your firearm, boy, it saves you a world of trouble, doesn't it?
And that's where defensive display around, perhaps put in the ground, if it can be done
Mm-hmm.
safely, take into consideration everything we said about whether are you in a rural area, are you in the city, is it a city that is really anti 2A? These are just all factors that probably need to be.
You make good points, Steve. It was animal control that I was struggling with before when I was saying Humane Society or ASPCI.
Hmm.
Animal control, I've been involved in scenarios where law enforcement was called and they brought in animal control. I've been involved where animal control was called and they brought in law enforcement. And then other situations where animal control was called because the animal was injured, and that was the end of it. But as I said earlier, in no situation, none of those circumstances was there ever a criminal prosecution.
Yeah, and you mentioned that, and in this case with the bear, in this article, I haven't read anything about law enforcement being involved. It was the Department of Fish and Wildlife that was called, and
Mm-hmm.
I don't think it ever elevated to law enforcement. So there's a
Like what you were saying, though, that Shawn, to put the bear out of its misery, the risk there legally is that you are deciding for yourself at that point to destroy an animal. And if it were someone's pet, you would be destroying their property and you would be
Mhm.
liable for the financial consequences of that, plus a whole lot more emotion that would come out of it. A bear might be a little different, but I don't know how that person, unless they have skills or it was painfully obvious to everyone that the only reasonable choice was to kill the bear.
Yeah.
That for me, like Steve, I think that's a decision better left to people that are experts. I'm interested to know, Steve, since we're talking about aggressive animals and options that you have. We know there are animals big enough and aggressive enough, even domesticated animals, pit bulls and Rottweilers, and some of the large breed dogs that are particularly strong. Any tips or suggestions on how you assess how much danger you are in, how much distance to be sure the animal stays or crosses over before you feel the need? We know the Tooler research for
Yeah,
humans, right? But I don't know where a
that
pit
dog's
bull
much
or,
faster
or a
than that.
bobcat, fits into that.
I tell you what, in terms of me, distance is not nearly as consequential as the manner in which that animal is approaching. And so you can kind of tell when that dog's running up there, but you can kind of tell he's going to probably get to a certain point and kind of lock it up and start barking at you. And those ones that are just accelerating. And if that animal is coming at me and I'm yelling at it and it's accelerating, then as soon as I think I can make the shot, I'm going to make the shot.
Mhm.
And the other thing is that this is something where there's a high probability that we could miss. And so the question is, if I do, where is that round going to go? And I think that's super critical. You've got to be, cognizant of what your backdrop is, and if it's at an angle on a concrete road or even an asphalt road, there's a high probability that if that bullet hits that oblique angle, it's going to skip off at maybe, I don't know, 10-degree angle, and it could represent a threat to someone else. So
Mhm.
just lots of things. But the main thing is that thing continuing to, a matter of fact, I look at it the same way with people. Is that person kind of running up there, but I can kind of tell he's going to probably stop at some point, and posture up and everything, or is he coming at me at a dead run? If anything, he's just accelerating the closer he gets. So that's the way I kind of view it, Don.
I find those scenarios get even more complicated when the person out for the walk, and you in this situation, has a small dog with you. And it's hard to know whether the attacking dog is going after you or your dog or both, or the dog first and then you if you try to intervene. So it's pretty complicated, tricky stuff, it sounds.
It really is. It really is. And so I'm kind of mindful of just putting anything that sounds black and white here because it's
Hmm.
like, okay, yeah, but you said, Steve, well, actually, yeah, but I didn't mean it in that regard, or I
Well,
wasn't contemplating.
Well, let me come full circle because Shawn started this segment talking about a mutual acquaintance who was concerned about a dog being able to have some defense against a dog. In this instance, it was a known dog that roamed pretty freely and got loose a lot and posed a fairly frequent problem in the neighborhood, would even come into people's backyards. And the question posed was, I'm worried about this dog. What do I do? I'm thinking of getting pepper spray. And the response by a trained law enforcement officer was, forget the pepper spray, get a gun. Whether that's true or not, I mean, the story's true. Whether that's the best advice or not, I don't know. But the officer's assessment was these kinds of dogs, and maybe even this dog in particular, can be so strong and so fast and almost resistant to pepper spray.
You're just going to piss the dog off by spraying
Yeah.
him?
It, I,
Is the idea?
well, I carry both, so I don't have just that hammer. So I've got a hammer and a screwdriver. So,
Well said.
maybe I
Yeah.
can, and again, a lot of dogs that come running up, especially if you're walking a dog, you can head them off pretty quick. And just by doing in that threatening manner, and you hit them with that pepper spray and get it anywhere close to them, and they get some of that. I mean, their noses are just so much more sensitive than ours. Then maybe that's all you need. But yeah, those people say, yeah, I'm going to go backpacking and I'm not going to take a gun. I'm just going to take bear spray. I'm going to take bear spray and a gun.
All right, everybody, that's the podcast for today. I appreciate you listening through to the end. We'll be back soon with more. Until then, as always, be smart, stay safe, take care.
I have plenty of respect for bears.